we signed up for a vegan river cruise out of Lyon, France. The price was right, just about $1,500 each for room and board for 7 nights, and about a third of the cost of another vegan tour we were looking at. It was on a small, comfortable, but luxurious Swiss cruiser hosted by Dirk, a German vegan who runs vegancruises.com. It promised to be a culinary delight, as well as an opportunity to meet others in this growing movement from around the world and to see a bit of old France along the way. Now, mind you, a big part of the draw was the elegant vegan cuisine that would effortlessly appear before us 3 times a day. You know, otherwise, I would never choose to visit Europe in November. After 70 Earth orbits around the sun, I'm pretty clear on seasons in temperate zones. And having lived in Eugene, Oregon, land of rain and clouds for 20 years, and noting that Rome is at the same latitude, I wasn't so sure. But despite that, as well as despite the ecological cost of flying back and forth across the Atlantic, it just felt right to go. So we signed up. Now, we're notoriously inclined towards impulsive decisions. That's how Richard and I met. It's how we got married. Both of those took place in bookstores. But that's another story. So, as the journey grew nearer, I kept watching the forecast, hoping for a ray or two of sun, but instead, it just showed day after day of rain and clouds, even flood warnings. Even the online travel videos of Lyon seemed to be consistently cloudy for some reason. Meanwhile, at home in Sedona, the weather promised to just continue in the most gorgeous Indian summer fashion that we've ever seen. I was hoping to work out some kind of a trade deal between France and Arizona that didn't come to pass. Well, sun worshiper that I am, that's why we're here, doubts began to creep in. But Dirk jovially assured me by email that the weather the last 2 years at the same time, same cruise, had been practically perfect. In any case, there was no refund at this point. So we decided to go ahead. Most likely, we would return alive. Even more likely, we have a good time. And of course, it's a good learning experience. So forward we went. Now, crossing the Atlantic on a long flight is never a piece of cake, especially for a couple of seniors who often look and feel pretty sharp, and yet are getting to the point that sometimes our idea of a good travelogue entertainment is to look at a near-death experience video. Seriously, check them out. There's some really good ones on ions.org. Fortunately, we found a well-priced flight on Air Canada, which we somewhat foolishly imagined would be more spacious than your standard American airline. In reality, it was tighter than average for Richard's long legs, and for me it was truly an acrobatic feat to reach down under the table and try to pull up the vegan snacks that we brought as our survival food on the trip. It would have served well for a dozen or so sardines, but it got us there. We departed Phoenix midday, and after a preternaturally short night, we arrived at 9 a.m. the next day in Lyon. Now, what happens to time, you wonder, on those jet lag things? I mean, is your life like now officially 9 hours shorter? From the airport, we grabbed a cab with a charming young Portuguese guy who took us straight to Les Ramparts, a modest hotel we had found not far from the boat dock where we were to board the next day. The room turned out to be small but fine. It was adequate, clean, not bad for less than $100 in a big city downtown in Europe. It even had working electricity. Now that was not clear at first. Not until we called the desk and we learned that yes, Americans, you have to put your room key card into a little slot by the front door, and that activates everything. It's a wonderful energy-saving device. Duh. Well, this turned out to be the norm in eco-conscious Europe. Now notice, for this vacation, we chose to do very little advanced homework. We just decided to roll with it. For this, I offer no excuses. We didn't even know French. We didn't study it. I offer no excuses except that in school I learned Spanish instead. It seemed more practical living in the Southwest. And at this point in life, frankly, it's pretty difficult to learn a new language. After laying out the luggage on the bed, we rested a short bit. It was about 2 a.m., you have to understand, at home. But then we followed the standard jet lag advice to switch quickly to local time, and we took most of the misty day to explore the old downtown area of Lyon. The mostly carless streets were paved with sturdy limestone blocks, but they were blocked in many places by noisy repair projects. Between orange barriers and rain puddles, there were an abundance of shops with stylish fashions, many made in France. Button-down cardigans like this one, which I got. Scarves, gloves, jackets, boots, purses, you name it, jewelry. The prices were fair, and it soon became clear I should have allowed a lot more room in my luggage. Once, we ran into an American couple, but otherwise, it seemed to be pretty much all locals, French people, Mediterranean-looking people, consistently dark-haired with fine, beautiful, mesmerizing features and chic attire. If you did not have chic attire, you would stand out. We ventured outside the main business district and explored an old cathedral, had some tea, and enjoyed the afternoon. Soon it was dinner time. So starting about 5 p.m., our normal early dinner time in the States, we began looking for some eats. We soon learned that finding vegan food on your own is a major challenge in this region of France. Now, we had consulted Happy Cow, but she had very little to say about veg food in this district. Again and again, we stared at mysterious French menus, trying to translate the words. Yes, we were Franco-challenged, but we felt pretty sure we understood the words for chicken, beef, cheese, pork, eggs, and salmon, and at least one of those delights was in virtually everything except for maybe the baguettes or black coffee. More than once, we considered moving up to the next culinary phase of human evolution, breatharianism. Yes, look it up. But not now. Now, you may understandably wonder why we made it so hard on ourselves. Why not just compromise a little bit, that'd be okay. And we did, actually. But I gotta let you know, if you're not yet vegan, this is a little bit like it would be for your basic American omnivore to eat dogs. Finally, we spotted a young Asian woman doing laundry in an open-air shop, and we asked her about Chinese restaurants. She kind of spoke English, took pity upon us. She kindly abandoned her post and actually ushered us across the street to the small dark door of a little tiny Chinese restaurant that she said would open in 20 minutes, at 7 o'clock by then. That's actually when most restaurants open for dinner in France, we learned. This was the first of several Asian angels that helped us out. No doubt they can empathize with other foreigners who can't quite do French or feel like outsiders, or maybe she was just steering us to a family restaurant, I don't know. So we whiled away a little time and returned at 7, just as it opened. There was a little hole in the wall with very fancy carved lacquered chairs and white tablecloths that reminded me of the Chinese restaurants of my youth in Phoenix, the kind with laughing Buddhas and little baubles and first-generation proprietors. Soon the owner emerged, a slightly scowling, older Chinese woman who probably had her fill of this kind of work by now. But she handed menus to each of us and to the one other couple seated nearby. We searched in vain for the vegetarian section, like you always see in Chinese American restaurants, right? Seeing nothing, we asked her what we might have without meat. Something with tofu? replying in a hybrid mix of English, French, and Chinese, plus the essential universal language of gesture. She dismissed this notion with raised eyebrow and something about no demand for tofu, or they couldn't get it there, or something like that. Okay. Well, that left us with a vegetable spring roll, white rice, and vegetable chop suey. It was tasty enough, for sure, but in mindful retrospect, I can only conclude that its kind of greasy undertone surely derived from once living French pigs. Now realize I have not intentionally eaten anything from pigs about 50 years now, and we ate it before we even realized it, and we lived to tell about it. Now restrooms were almost as hard to find as vegan food in downtown Lyon, and so before leaving, we each with gratitude crawled our way up some steep, winding stairs, wooden stairs, without any hand railing. You kind of push against the wall to a little tiny bathroom. Apparently in the late Middle Ages, there were no building codes to cover this kind of thing. Stomachs full enough, we found our way back to the hotel and crashed. The 2 twin beds were comfortable enough, and we got a decent sleep despite a late-night courtyard chorus of young men and young women laughing and chatting alternately in bass and soprano waves. It was quite unlike the usual random cacophony that you hear at parties where we come from. It was like the men were of one voice, and the women laughed and responded as another voice. It was curious, and it went on till probably 1 a.m. local time. Despite nearby construction and not being the best neighborhood, the hotel was a good solid place. And fortunately, we learned later, the next day, we had managed to avoid another hotel where there were ghosts, apparently left over from torture victims during Nazi occupation in World War II. One can only imagine all the things that have taken place in a city like Lyon that goes all the way back to Roman times and before. Soon it was breakfast and time again to eat. Now, compared to standard issue free breakfasts at many American hotels, €16 each for the spread in the small room behind the lobby seemed a little steep, but there really was no option, as you can see by now. The breakfast was centered around the typical petit déjeuner, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, fare in France. Slices of ham, salmon, cucumbers, tomatoes, citrus, boiled eggs, toast, pastries, croissants, familia, nuts, dried fruit, and cold cereals. So we poured out an ample bowl of the raw oat mix with nuts, fruits, and coffee, and we looked in vain for any kind of dairy-free milk, and in the end we had to succumb to our first taste of bovine secretions in some 5 years since we went from vegetarian to vegan. And we just had to hope that somehow French dairy cows have better lives than American ones. We were the last guests at this particular breakfast, and they held it for us longer in honor of our jet lag because we got up kind of late. Just before we left, we mentioned the lack of dairy options to the pretty young server who'd been quietly coming and going. Amazingly, and this was one of our first such serendipitous encounters, it turned out she volunteered that she herself was a committed vegan, as well as was her mother. She said they actually usually served soy milk, but others had consumed it all before we came. So we were all thrilled to find kindred spirits, and we had a lively half-hour exchange in fluent veganese and in easy English as well. Her mother was from Australia. We shared our why vegan stories, the names of our favorite books and websites and films and tips and so on. She said it wasn't easy being a vegan in Lyon, where summers, by the way, are now quite unbearably hot and they don't have air conditioning. I gave her my business card and invited her and her mother to come and stay with us if they should ever come to Sedona, particularly to the Sedona Veg Fest in January. Maybe it was a predestined connection. Maybe it's the reason we went on this trip. Who knows? I really don't know. Checking out, we chatted with the friendly, suave young Frenchman at the desk, handsome like they all are. He also spoke English well, which was not that common outside of hotel lobbies. His features were so attractive, the eyes and the noble face, the high cheekbones, the delicate nose, that you just kind of get mesmerized and you kind of miss half of what they're saying until you get kind of used to this. I observed to him that the French they're pretty lucky, like they live in a nice culture. They have many nice things about their culture and their left-leaning government. He wryly noted that they nevertheless love to complain about everything. He said that no matter who's president, they're never as good as the last one. He himself was adverse to politics. Later, a friend of ours who grew up in French schools and had a French mother underscored that the French enjoy their sullenness. Thank you. Especially during the sullen, rainy season. I also happened to look online at a Buddhist retreat that's in France, and they are featuring a special thing, their 3-month rainy season retreat. Somehow I had kind of missed all this when I signed up. Anyway, we bid adieu, and we pulled out our suitcases and rolled them across a graffiti-strewn bridge in search of the ship. I find the amount of graffiti in France kind of disconcerting. Much of it's plastered on beautiful old masonry buildings and walls. It would not be easy to paint over. Clearly, something is amiss in the Republic. Perhaps good employment, someone suggested later. But soon we found our ship, and we were welcomed warmly aboard. And they carried our luggage into the room. A friendly staff member from Eastern Europe, as was most of the crew. Our king bed cabin was beautiful and well appointed. It had a lovely patio door opening to the outside. Its Swiss designers could not have done a better job, and it was a treat to unpack our suitcases and settle in for a week. We had ample, drawers and places to hang your clothes, a wonderfully designed bathroom with the plumbing had both an overhead kind of rain shower and a handheld shower, and that was on one faucet, and the other faucet had hot or cold, and the hot came on instantly. How cool is that? It was all perfect. And especially now that we understood the little key thing about putting our card in the slot by the front door so the lights would come on. The cuisine. Soon we were treated to an abundant lunch buffet as Dirk, a tall and fair-haired fellow, welcomed us all aboard the ship. It was delightful and colorful, punctuated by French pastries, faux salmon, faux ham, and faux cheese, and it was mostly a salad bar, colorful and delicious. Indeed, the cuisine did not disappoint, except perhaps for a few purists who don't like sugar, white flour, oil, and the faux meats and cheeses, and prefer to have a more healthy diet of mostly steamed whole plant foods. Otherwise, 3 times a day, it was a feast as artfully prepared as any fine French cuisine, I'm sure. Sometimes I honestly had to wonder, frankly, if it was really fully vegan. Like those creamy soups, they just tasted so dairy-like. So at one point I asked the chef, what did he use for a creamy sauce? They're like cashews or what? And he said, well, I don't really know. It's a package thing. I don't make everything. I got this. It's for vegetarians. Hopefully, Dirk and his assistant had vetted this. Anyway, breakfast was always lush with rich croissants, pastries, breads, fruit compotes, smoothies, fresh juices, vegan versions of the typical French spread of sliced ham, cheese, and salmon, along with sliced grapefruit, familia, hot cereal, all kinds of nuts, seeds, and dried fruits for toppings, and of course, without question, soy or almond milk and creamer. At the end of every breakfast line was a smiling chef who was very eager to prepare you a tofu scramble or a vegan omelet, vegan sausage or bacon, and so on. I tried this a couple of times, but it wasn't really, honestly, the best one I've ever had, and I ultimately focused on our usual cereal, toast, fruit, and smoothies. And of course, I had some croissants. Yeah, I've never had vegan croissants before, and these were quite tasty. Now, lunch was always my favorite. It was a tasty, colorful salad bar. with a hot option or two, usually like lasagna or roast fingerling potatoes. And it always featured nicely seasoned coleslaws or roasted beet or mushroom mixes, green beans, corn, and other such delights. Interestingly, usually the salad bar at lunch lacked things like kidney beans or garbanzos and other such legumes that are common to American salad bars. And very tempting sweets were presented at every meal: breakfast, lunch, tea time, and dinner. It was hard to keep off the sugar. Dinner was more formal. It came in the form of a menu, and we would sit more formally. It would give us 2 choices of salads, 2 choices of entrees, and 2 choices of dessert. Of course, you couldn't see it, and it was kind of hard to understand. When you got salad, you thought maybe this is going to be greens, but usually it was something more like with couscous or some little tiny braised bit of endive, artfully presented, something like that. It was kind of hard to get greens, honestly. The entrees tended to be also a little light on grains and kind of heavy on rich, kind of oily or creamy sauces. It was all gourmet type stuff. And the desserts were always very tempting and very rich. But the staff worked very hard, and one day I passed my compliments to the server, and I added, "You must be enjoying the same good food, huh?" He smiled somewhat furtively and said, "We get meat." Much of the draw of this cruise, besides the food, was simply spending a week making new vegan friends from all around the world. How global, how diverse, I thought. As it turned out, a lot of our fellow Americans were thinking the same thing. Nearly all of us on board were Yanks, except for maybe like 4 Germans, 2 Taiwanese, 4 or so from the United Kingdom, and 3 expats now in France or Costa Rica. That really counts as Americans. But no matter, it's always a delight to meet new vegans and to spend a whole week together making friends. It was wonderful. It's kind of like it used to be when we would flash peace signs to other freaks from our VWs back in the day. Maybe born-agains feel the same way when they spot a fellow Christian out there in the devil's playground. You just kind of appreciate kindred souls in a world that often does not really support your core values, or maybe just doesn't see yet that how they're eating doesn't align with their values. We met great people from everywhere, from Wales, from Chicago, from all over the US, and a surprising number of our vegan comrades, to my biased northern mind, were from the South. And one woman from Houston, as well as another from Nashville, did say they felt pretty isolated as vegans out where they lived. One from Atlanta found it easier. But one couple, a friendly retired couple from Birmingham, found it quite easy in Alabama. He'd taught at the university there for many years, and they actually have an entire vegan cafeteria line. Who knew? They were a very open, friendly, down-home couple, happy to wear plaid shirts in France and just be themselves, and they were probably our favorite people on the whole trip. I also enjoyed particularly some discussions with a retired German train engineer who was now studying vegan nutrition. He was especially excited also about a new wave of thinking that's coming out of Europe about creating a new form of common welfare economy. Neither self-serving capitalism nor kind of overly controlling socialism, but an approach that's especially articulated by a Christian Felbert based on the overarching principle of always seeking the highest good for all. I like that. It's a phrase that's been going through my mind a lot lately, so it was another one of those synchronicities. He referred me to Felbert's books, including Change Everything, Creating an Economy for the Common Good, and Trading for Good, How Global Trade Can Be Made to Serve People, Not Money. As we all got to know each other a bit, a few evenings into the cruise, Dirk invited us into the lounge after a typical gourmet dinner to offer us all a chance to tell our why vegan stories. I shared how watching Cowspiracy had made all the difference for me as I learned the key role of a vegan diet in saving the resources and the atmosphere of our planet. Richard talked about seeing the suffering of chickens in factory farms and of other animals early in his veterinary career, and he said, the real question is, why didn't I go vegan sooner? A friendly lawyer from Atlanta eagerly told her story of being bedridden over a decade with insufferable pain from a spinal injury. Now, with very little help from countless medicines or from doctors, she finally found her way to Hippocrates Health Institute in Florida and later to True North in Santa Rosa. And there, a whole food, plant-based, oil-free diet just changed her life incredibly, and it turned her into a lifelong advocate. Another woman's health story was interesting in that she learned from her adventures that a number of people, quite a few, have a particular gene that impacts the storage and use of vitamin B12. Even though her blood levels appeared to be high, it wasn't working for her. So after not thriving on a vegan diet, a doctor switched her to the methylated form of B12, and then her health soared. So that was an interesting thing to become alerted to. One of the most unusual stories was from the lady from Taiwan, and she had actually become vegan because her Tai Chi instructor said that would be best for her energy flow. Another most unusual and rather spiritually oriented story was of a man who'd eaten vegetarian briefly in his youth. At that point, he'd done it wrongly and it wasn't so good for his health. So later he became a paleo with kind of a vengeance, and he would often rail against vegans and say the science didn't support it. But then somehow, one time after he did a deep meditation, was very heart-centered, he saw a very clear vision of a cow. And he felt such deep love for this cow that he realized he could never eat animals again. His charming African-American wife was no way at first, but their 3 millennial kids got right on board, and they came and got on board the cruise as well. The 5 of them ate together all the time. And after he spoke, his wife then delivered a hilarious account, worthy of stand-up comedy, of how she went from kicking and screaming to going along with the program. Most interestingly, it turned out that they live just a couple of hours away from us, and they'll probably come to the Sedona Veg Fest this year. So we made some new friends that may last longer. And we might see others as well. The postcards disappeared quickly that I laid out for the Veg Fest. And Sedona, frankly, is a pretty easy sell. Meeting all these lovely people and others on the cruise was, in the end, the best part of the whole trip, and I will always treasure that. And then there was the trip. A taste of it follows here. 2 large rivers meet in Lyon, the Rhone on the east and the Saône on the west. We started with a 2-day jaunt going north on the Saône to Chalon-sur-Saône, from which most of us took a bus tour to nearby wine country and, as another choice, to the farmers' market town of Lyon. The day was cloudy and the market had just folded up about the time we arrived, and soon we found ourselves being guided to a strange portal to another time. A strange relic from the late Middle Ages known as the Hotel Dieu. I don't know if I'm saying that right, because depending on how you say it, Dieu can mean two or it can mean God in French.
Yeah. Up ahead in the distance, I saw a shimmering light. It grew heavy and my sight grew dim.
Should you,
I just stopped
after
for the
death,
night.
find yourself in some strange ethereal realm where you learn that time and space is not what you think it is,
I was thinking to myself, this could be heaven or this could be hell.
and you can just kind of pick a little slot and go live yourself a life in any time and any place, like a movie kind of. And you see a door marked Middle Ages, do not enter. I caution you, do not enter. Not unless, of course, you like creepy. Well, Hotel Jew sounds kind of like God's hotel. There's more to be said here. Built by a rich nobleman to atone for some wrongdoing by creating an ornate hospice for the sick, this place was relatively plush in its own creepy kind of Middle Ages kind of way. The main ward was kind of like a big church, cathedral-like space, and it was lined with little rows of beds and little red velvet enclosed alcoves. Each bed was all white and fluffy, and it was about 4 feet wide, and there would lie 2 people, which would help keep them warm. But I have to say, woe to the one that was a little smaller, or just, for whatever reason got pushed out of bed or laid awake for hours to a chorus of snoring or moaning, or worse. I might add, they weren't supposed to have contagious diseases. But while awake as a patient, your entertainment would be to look up at the ceiling through your delirium, and there you would see these carved wooden monsters that were kind of swallowing the beams over everything, and in between them, along the edge of the rafters, were wild-eyed human faces depicting the shortcomings that surely caused your illness. Could be gluttony, or anger, or sloth, avarice, foolishness, or whatever. Further along the way, there was a more ornate chamber for the rich, and that was surrounded by elaborate paintings, large stained glass windows, and appropriate levels of musty air. Passing through the apothecary and a sewage ditch where the attending nuns would dump all the bed wastes into the river, we paused in the kitchen, and there life-size models of nuns were preparing soup from plastic chickens, potatoes, and carrots. Finally, we landed in the secret, sacred, dark room where the sisters hid a great work of medieval art, painted on a series of folding panels so it could be protected from light and from marauders. There we were graphically reminded of the full glory of the medieval religious mindset, a heavenly hierarchy detailing the final judgment, with Jesus, the apostles, and angels hovering high up in his heavenly realms, and below, a scary process of weighing each soul's good and bad deeds. Some went to heaven, including the church's benefactor, of course, who was nicely painted in the background, and some, alas, were cast naked and screaming down into hell with the most fearful faces imaginable. In this harsh reality, there was no limbo and no nuance, no matter that good people were imperfect, and no matter that the bad kids were nice now and then. Clearly, the Middle Ages was not a time for free thinkers or agnostics. It was a black and white world, and you had better believe and behave exactly as the esteemed hierarchy of the Holy Church and their rich, powerful allies instructed, with awesome pomp and circumstance and staging designed to impress the masses, or else. It must have been scary, and it still is, for many raised with threats of hellfire and damnation, not to mention earthly hells, underscored for me later as I watched an in-flight French movie on the way home, By the Grace of God, a recent true story of men who were childhood victims of pedophilic priest in the big old cathedral of Fair Lyon.
Prénat est revenu sur la région de Lyon, comme avant.
Il t'a vu.
Oui, je sais. Pourquoi cet homme s'occupe-t-il encore d'enfants?
Les samedis après-midi, il m'emmenait dans le local photo de la paroisse. Il me disait c'est notre secret.
Je suis horrifié par ce que vous me dites.
Oui, enfin, moi, ce que j'attends, c'est une sanction de l'Église à son encontre.
Je vais être clair avec vous, le père Prénat restera toujours prêtre.
Vous avez une idée d'autres victimes?
So finally, we passed quickly through the hospital's gift shop, ever so grateful to slip back into the fresh air where tourists in the modern day strolled past wine and gift shops as we waited for our bus back. That was pretty much the first and last extra tour that we took on the trip, other than just walking around the villages that we passed through on our own, along with many other people who chose that route. Otherwise, the choices were kind of either arduous, like a slippery, muddy hike up some steep mountains, which we have plenty of in our lives, or a steam train, up a steep mountain. Again, we have lots of mountains, but we don't have very much in the way of charming French village life in our lives, so we decided we'd check that out more. About half of the passengers took the other optional paid excursions. On one of those excursions, an unfortunate lady slipped in the mud, broke her femur, and had to leave the tour. These things are more arduous than they might appear for some people. Well, we did see plenty of old French towns. They began to blend one into the next, and as I kind of labeled my photographs after we came home, I had to kind of really consult the maps and the schedules. We cruised smoothly and quietly down the mighty Rhone, passing through many locks. The road would be lowered and you'd just be a few inches away from a big block wall right in front of you. In most of those cities, Richard and I would walk into a local cathedral and sit meditatively for 10 to 15 minutes, soaking in the impressive stillness and grandeur. And that was all well and good, except about 3 days in, when we stopped at a particularly musty one, St. Vincent Cathedral, built in the 12th century, which is the oldest cathedral still in use in France, and it's at the top of what I have since referred to as the ghost city of Veg-heads. With no one to guide us, the optional city tour began at 9 p.m. well after we were asleep. We landed in the city a bit after lunch on another cloudy day. We walked up a lovely tree-lined avenue with plane trees planted by Napoleon to shade his armies, and it soon rose into a labyrinth of dark, narrow streets of ancient medieval alleyways. The streets were barely wide enough for a Renault, had any ventured in, but we saw not a single car. In fact, we saw not a single local person, just people, a few from our own tour, wandering around. You would see some signs of possible habitation, like a few maybe flowers on a doorway, and the doorway maybe had been kept up, but right next to it there might be kind of a dark hole with trash behind it and rotten timbers that maybe hadn't been replaced in about 300 years and like that, And the windows were pretty much boarded up and few in number. It was pretty creepy. Well, later on we got the scoop from the intrepid people that took the late night tour, and also a little internet surfing. And we learned that in medieval times, this city had a population of 30,000, but it now houses less than 4,000, and I think probably a lot of them are not in the old part. Back in the day, property taxes were based on windows, so windows were small and few. And we did see a few larger openings, about maybe this wide, and they were kind of like little old garages or something. Well, it turned out that's where people kept their cows, imprisoned together with them in the dark, cold places, and they kept each other warm. When it was time for slaughter, they would take the cow out in the street and do it there. And as it turned out, given streets would be dedicated to a certain trade, like raising and butchering cows for one, and another one would be next door, would be where they'd do the tanning and skinning and making leather and so on. And at least they They saw exactly where their meat came from, unlike most people today. But again, I must, with all earnestness, caution you, do not incarnate in such a time and place, should it ever be an option. Or maybe just jump in and do it. Above this abandoned medieval labyrinth, there was a small highway with a few cars passing by and not much else in the way of shops. So we turned around and we wandered back and we found our way into an ancient cathedral for our typical moment of quiet. Now, this old cathedral of Viviers was perhaps the most musty experience of my entire life. Now imagine, if you will, sticking your nose into a compost bin full of moldy bread. Or maybe being locked up in a sealed wooden shed that's leaking rain. It's about 1,000 years old. Now, multiply that by 100. From the moment we entered, we breathed shallowly, bravely thinking we were stronger than these billions of ancient mold colonies who were happy to lodge in our lungs. Not coincidentally, that night, I felt the first small scratch in the throat that says, "You may be developing a cold. Take it easy." Usually, nearly always, I win that battle and it doesn't develop. Take a few herbs, rest a little bit, it's fine. But the combined assault was just too much. A long plane ride, jet lag, a certain loudly snoring bed partner, and no place to go. Sugar, oil, and finally this, ancient molds. Sometimes I think those little guys slipped in and interbred with some nasty viruses that I later learned were surely shed on the stair rails and serving utensils on the ship by a lady who'd had to leave the cruise early on due to illness. And thus began the crud, as my father would call it. In the next day or so, a few others, as well as myself, began experiencing a little bit of sore throats or scratchiness, or maybe attributing it to the air, or they're not sure. Now, I don't know how it turned out for them. But while I did stave it off a little bit for a few days with vitamin C and such, by the end of the cruise, it was clearly entrenched. But we continued, of course, and we wandered into the various villages and saw lots of interesting sights and shops and old universities and funerals. We saw an interesting castle that kind of reminded me of my parents' summer home with a winding staircase, and I kind of think in some other life they had actually lived in such a place, and I thought, this might be it. But all in all, again, I repeat the advice, even as a king or a queen, I don't think you want to live in the Middle Ages. It's just too stony and dark and cold and overly hierarchical. We ended up in Arles, the town where Van Gogh did most of his paintings and finished out his life in a somewhat tragic manner. We spent a while looking for the Van Gogh Cafe and found it. It turned out to be closed, but that's okay. We had ourselves a little tea nearby, and I slipped into a little gallery, the only one I had seen. Started to walk in, but they were hanging a show, and we got to talking for a moment, and they sensed that I was an artist, and they actually invited me to apply to be in their gallery. Wow, I thought, what a cool thing. I think actually they'd probably really like some of my Impressionist style paintings here, because they don't seem to have much of that going on here. It probably would work, In retrospect, I think it's one of those vanity galleries where they just soak you for all your money or take your paintings or something. I don't know what. I've had emails about those through the years. Anyway, for just a little while, I fantasized living in Arles for about a month and maybe mounting up a show and having a great time. But all in all, I don't think that's ever going to happen. So we went on, and the next day we went to another city that was kind of big, and it was really pretty smoggy and full of noise and construction and stuff, and with the cold that was developing, I started to get a pretty bad headache. Arles was the southernmost point of the trip, and we then turned around as it was getting sunny and headed back up north to Lyon, and before we knew it, it was time for our final night celebration before our landing in Lyon. The last night of the cruise, we both went to bed soon after the glorious final dinner, in which the chef and kitchen staff staged a dramatic performance as they served up baked Alaska, extraordinary, vegan style, and complete with flames. We missed the final party, but that was okay. The next morning, we said our goodbyes, trying not to spread too many germs in the process, and we rolled our luggage back to the district of Lyon, where we'd spent the first night, searching with some difficulty for the rental car agency to launch our add-on trip, which was 4 nights on our own in Annecy, a lakeside resort town about an hour and a half to the east of Lyon. I had chosen it simply because it was one of, quote, the 10 most charming little towns in France, and it was the closest one. Finally, we found the car agency. The agent even spoke English, and she showed us into a very fancy digital prize of a shiny new French car. It wasn't quite as great, though, when it came to basics, with the malfunctioning driver's window that she sort of fixed for us, but we were afraid to roll it down again in case it wouldn't come back up. And so that meant that I, as a passenger, had to periodically leap out, run across the front of the car, and dash over to toll booths or parking meter places and so forth. Once we got out in the open, it was still a freeway, but on either side there was a really verdant countryside, quite beautiful, and the suggestion of charming villages. And had it not been lunchtime and we had been feeling better, we probably would have gone off to explore some of those. We could live here, we mused briefly. It's so beautiful. Before long, we arrived in Annecy, and it turned out not to be really a small town, but a pretty good-sized city with freeways and so on. And at first, I kind of doubted my choice, but soon we found our way to the elegant hotel I had booked us at for 3 nights, the Lakeside Imperial Palace, where I had gotten us a luxurious lake view room, or so I thought. The valet was very charming. He seemed almost kind of British, really, and he ushered us up high to the 8th floor, surely the greatest view of all. Well, disappointments, they say, can only happen when you have an appointment. What we found instead was a pretty drab kind of brown room with a little high porthole of a window that, yes, if you opened the glass door in front of it and you went and stood on a very sharp little rail that kind of hurt your foot, it was indeed, when you leaned out, it was indeed a very spectacular view. Well, need I say more? Soon we were back down to the front desk to complain. And there a lovely French woman, again with mesmerizing features that you can hardly even understand what she's saying. Her eyes are so amazing. She checked graciously with her manager, but no, there just was no other option. There really wasn't. But for our 3rd night and last night, they would move us to the room type that we thought we had paid for, with a balcony, the full-on view, and so on. Meanwhile, they would work on fixing this issue in their system. Nevertheless, Annecy was, for the most part, a very delightful town. We arrived in early afternoon, and we began immediately searching for a vegan restaurant we had found on Happy Cow. We walked about, half a mile or so, and found our way there. And glory be, after we pushed on the door and it didn't seem to open, and we thought they had closed, somebody opened it for us, and they were indeed open, and we got ourselves some kind of quiche-like thing and some soup, and it was fine. We thought, we'll come back here. As it turned out, it was never open again. That's another story. So after that, we walked around the beautiful lake nearby where there were swans and a really well-designed multi-use pedestrian and bike path that anyone could emulate. It was just very charming. And then rested a bit, and it was time for dinner. And we thought, let's drive around a little bit and look at some of these elegant looking neighborhoods up on the slopes of the beautiful alpine mountains overlooking this lovely lake. And so we drove around a little bit, and soon it was getting dark, and GPS was of absolutely no help in this situation. Because there's so many one-way streets, the route to this place looks something like this. The 14-minute option just did not work with streets blocked. So we were left with the other options. And mind you, it was dark. So the little voice would say something like, after the third roundabout, turn right on the second exit to Rue de Rochelet, and then you must proceed to the course. Well, Rue de Rochelet or whatever, first of all, if you were walking along on the street and you had a flashlight and you aimed it at the appropriate place on some building, you probably could see that street sign. But driving along in the dark in a car, no way. So finally, I just looked at the general shape and form of the map. And I said, I think you turn left at this next thing, like an acute left turn, and then you go about 3 blocks and you turn right there. And finally, we sort of found our way to the old town, and we found a place to park, and then we had to walk another 10 minutes or so. And we got there, and the darn place, they were on vacation. So we looked and looked as we had in Lyon, and there was nothing, really. We finally ended up settling for a crepe, which probably had a bit of cheese in it, at a creperie. We found our way back home, went to bed in the little porthole attic, and slept. Next day, however, it was a beautiful, sunny, glorious day. The first one we'd really had that was fully sunny pretty much all day long on the whole trip. The valet very kindly rented us some electric bikes, and we took a wonderful ride around the lake. This is really the highlight of the trip for me. And it was just gorgeous. After the bike ride, we decided to head on downtown about mid-afternoon, get some lunch, and we did finally find something. It wasn't very satisfactory, but something out of a little natural food store. Ate it in a park. They were having some kind of pig festival in the main square by the big cathedral there in Annecy. And you can see here that the pigs looked reasonably happy. I don't know if they really knew what was coming their way soon. We were getting hungry, but not for pig's feet. We looked around, and we found a little restaurant off of that square that served some kind of a mushroom pasta that probably has some kind of creamy sauce in it, but not really too much cream, and a beautiful salad. And it was very charming, and for the first time we felt kind of like we could just partake of the French cafe life and kind of just be one of the crowd. And we looked around, and the French people were all there having their conversations and being very French. So we decided to join in. The food was delicious. We spent the next day or two wandering around Annecy. We drove around a little bit, but mostly we walked the streets. We checked out the shops. And it was interesting also in that Annecy has been called the Venice of France. It has some beautiful canals running through it into the lake. Finally, we got our long-awaited room with a view, and it was indeed quite a view. And eventually it was time to go back to Lyon, where we were going to spend the night in a high-class hotel and depart the next day for home. It was quite a feat to find the rental car place again, and once again I was resorting to, I think it's this way and that way, and consulting people. We finally found our way through a bunch of one-way mazes, back to the rental car place, parked the thing, got out of there, and rolled our bags about half a mile up to the luxury hotel. And there we checked in and were pleased to find a nice room. A luxury room with a view for our final night, as we thought. We went out to dinner at a fancy restaurant. Sometime in the middle of the night, though, we both were getting so socked in with the colds, so full of mucus and headaches and all that, we both at the same time realized we've got to extend our tour. I can't fly the next day. We're going to, first of all, infect everybody on the plane, and we might even get pneumonia. Who knows? So I consulted my trusty iPhone and saw that there were a few flights one way that could be obtained for about $1,000 for the two of us to LA in 4 days. So that's what we decided to do out of Paris. So we hung on in this hotel, which really became kind of like the Hotel Dieu, truly a hospital instead of a hotel. We ate every morning at their high-end buffet, the same kind of familiar food and so on we'd had elsewhere. And we looked around Lyon a bit. One day we went to the big cathedral up on the hill. You take a funicular, it's kind of like a tramway up there, and looked around. It was a glorious view. And just about that time, I started getting a nosebleed. So I sat down on the edge of the curb in the middle of this big plaza. There weren't any benches or anything. And just Richard was there. A priest walked by in the distance at one point. And I was, meanwhile, trying to catch all this blood in this snotty handkerchief that was all terribly full of hacking. And I don't even want to demonstrate for you. There was so much. And about this time, what I can only call an Asian angel arrived. A middle-aged man who started doing energy healings on me from about 5 feet away. I asked him if he was a doctor, and he wasn't, but he just was concerned and caring, and that was very cool. And then oddly enough, about 20 minutes later, we made our way down the hill and were looking for lunch, and we saw an Asian restaurant and walked in, and there was a man who looked a lot the same. It wasn't the same guy, and we were the only customers in the restaurant. And we ordered some food. We told him we were vegan, but that didn't really quite register because we did end up getting some little strips of what was clearly ham in the Thai rice. And there was that same hammy taste in the vegetable chop suey. But oh well. So anyway, meanwhile, he would come along and much more friendly than any French people ever were to us, was tapping me on my shoulders like, here's a Thai massage, and showing me some Tai Chi and all kinds of things. You know, at the end of our lunch there, we felt very cared for and nurtured. And we gave him a tip, and he said, oh, let me give you some sake. So we had a little glass of sake with him, and he was just so kind. And that was really enjoyable. We went back there the next day for lunch as well. And so we wandered around several days in Lyon and mostly just slept and rested. And then we kept seeing the same view out the window from our room, and we watched the street life down below, and we watched the sunlight, and we watched the snow, which started happening the last night. Now that last night, we did finally find a vegan entree at a local restaurant in Lyon. It was a burger, and it was flat out the worst vegan meal I have ever had anywhere. Most of them are pretty decent. This one was like a huge, tasteless blob of sweet potatoes and unspecified goo without any seasoning or condiments on a big white bun with big, huge, tasteless French fries. I don't know how they took the flavor out of the potatoes, but they somehow did. They were inedible. We had to leave about half of our food on our plates, and I'm not the kind of gal that usually does that. So my advice to the French, perfect that vegan cuisine. Be proud of it. Be the best. But more on that in a moment. So we got a fairly decent night's sleep, and we got up, looked around Lyon a little bit, and then we caught a cab to another train station, which is going to take us for our final leg of the journey to Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris. Now you may be wondering, why didn't we spend those last 4 add-on days in gay Paris? Basically, We needed a hospital, and the hotel served quite well for that. We were in no shape to take on new adventures at that point. And then with much confusion and difficulty, it was much easier when we traveled in Italy years before. We finally found our way onto the train, and we made it to Charles de Gaulle Airport, where we had booked a Holiday Inn Express for our final night in France. So we could take off the next day for LA, and then we're going to take a long layover and then go to Phoenix. So we arrive at Charles de Gaulle Airport, and it seems kind of more like a big, cold, kind of plebeian train station with hardly any signs to really, make it clear where to go. We had been told you're supposed to take some kind of a train or something to get to the hotel. Wasn't clear. Finally, with the help of people in the handicap aid assistant section of the airport, we learned how to find this train, and we went all the way down all the different stops to the very end of the line. We got out, and all we saw was just no signs, just kind of a concrete stairway going up to some place through some glass door. And on the other side of the stairway, a guy was coming down saying, "Do you know where the hotels are?" And we didn't know. But finally, the three of us figured out. You go up the stairs, lugging all your suitcases, no elevator that I could see, and across the track and down the other side into the rain along a long walkway, there was a tiny little sign that said Holiday Express this way. So we followed it. It was your basic adequate Holiday Inn Express, and it had a nice room. They had a buffet for dinner. Richard said, "It seems kind of expensive, it's like €27." I said, "No, baby, we're eating that." And it was one of the best meals we had on the entire trip. It had things that we just love, like potatoes and corn and peas and salad and all that kind of good stuff. So we did quite well there. And the next day, we found our way back to the airport. We understood the principle of it now. And we found our way to the better section of the airport, much more elegant than the train level, with red velvet-looking chairs, and there was duty-free shops, and it was just very what you'd expect it to be in the Charles de Gaulle Airport. We were taking a flight on Air Tahiti, and it was a nice big plane, and we ended up with a bulkhead seat, glory be. And that was a perfect condition, actually, for later on when the Polynesian stewardess was trying to help Richard figure out his little tray and how to get it up. And at the same time, I had my head down there doing something or other, and I came up just as she was coming down, and we collided heads. And I think it got her in a more sensitive place, and she just never seemed to take to me after that. But anyway, on the way home, there was this very interesting movie, which I mentioned before, about the pedophilic priests of Lyon. And it gave us also an interesting inside view of what was going on in some of those fancy French buildings on the second, third, fourth layers, like what kind of apartments people live in and what kind of lives they have. And it was a good movie. I'd recommend it. Finally, after many hours, I think it was about a 12-hour, 14-hour flight, we made it to LAX. And there, even though we've been Americans our whole lives, somehow we were suspicious. Everybody was suspicious. We went through some automatic thing where you put your passport down. We thought we got it handled. But no, then the next step is to get into this line. And it's a line that took literally about an hour and a quarter to get through. Most of the people in the line did not seem to speak English very well, and I kept thinking we're in the wrong line. But even the helpers didn't seem to speak English very well. Turned out we were in the right line. They're just slow as molasses. Again, we couldn't find any decent vegan food in the LA International Airport. Took a nap on the floor, caught our flight, made it home to Phoenix late at night, went to a Sheraton hotel we had booked in North Phoenix. Turned out to have a big, kind of musty roof over a central courtyard, and you could tell they were trying to circulate air in this place, but it just exacerbated the sinus headache that kept trying to stave off or kept coming back, on this trip once the cold started. And about 4 a.m., I say to Richard, I can't take it. I can't sleep anymore. Look, I'm awake. I'll drive us back to Sedona right now. I need fresh air. Please, let's go. So he said, okay. So I drove. We got out. And then, of course, the final obstacle of the trip, we had Highway 17 north to Sedona was closed in both directions. We'd been warned of this on our phones. And Fortunately, we were able to find our way around the detour in the dark. It wasn't that bad. Got back on the highway, got the fresh air. It felt so good. Saw the early morning light as it spread itself out gloriously over the wide open spaces of northern Arizona. And before you knew it, we were back in Sedona. It was so glorious. It was so beautiful. We kissed the ground. We called up our friend Mary Beth, who'd been taking care of our house. We went out to breakfast at the Coffee Pot, had a wonderful time, did a morning meditation thing that we do on Sunday mornings. It was just sunny and glorious, and we were so glad to be home. And all I could think was, I'm never leaving home again. Now, is that the moral of the story? Not really. I think it just probably was the luck of the draw, to go at a time when the weather wasn't so great. And I've heard since then that cruises are notorious places to pick up colds. And, I was grabbing the handrail and everything a lot just to kind of try to ease my arthritis. And I wasn't never thinking about washing my hands, when we were doing all those buffet lines and all that stuff. I just felt kind of cavalier about it. But anyway, it was pretty hard cold, and it's taken about 2 weeks or so after getting home to really start feeling like energy back to normal. But a number of people have been asking me about, how did the cruise go? How was it? And so this is my offering to you. Instead of repeating the story a million times, I thought I would share it. And if you're interested in going on a vegan cruise, I can encourage you. Sounds good. I also wanted to add that the last day that we spent in Lyon at breakfast, I learned that the servers there at breakfast were all students at a culinary school. And I mentioned something about how it would be helpful if they had more things for vegans. And we talked about that, and turned out she herself, again, was very interested in vegan cuisine. And we together decided that probably part of the issue with France in particular is that the French are so proud of their cuisine, and they're not ready to change it anytime soon. Tradition is very strong. And so I suggested to her, as a young new person getting into the culinary trade, maybe the way to reframe that was just to say, we French can have the very best vegan cuisine. She liked that. So maybe that made a difference. Who knows? As for France in general, I just wanted to share a few observations also. I did notice that a lot of French people seemed true to the thing that I've heard. I wouldn't exactly say snooty, but just a little reserved and kind of holding their faces in a rather elegant and high eyebrow kind of way. Other than those that were, working in hotels, and those were pretty friendly. But other people didn't respond to smiles, didn't seem as casual and relaxed and friendly as many people do in the US, not everyone. And I just kind of wonder if maybe they've become, perhaps because of their natural good looks, so obsessed with beauty and their appearance and architecture and art and fine things that they've, to some extent, lost touch with their spirit, with their soul. It's an issue for all of us, those things. But it was a way of learning, a kind of reflection to see that and to reflect on, how do we all do that? So those are my observations of life in France. I am so grateful to live in a place that's more fresh and open, and where you have neither the charm nor the burden of a lot of built structures from way back that represent a culture that no longer really exists in its hierarchical kind of way. And to have something that feels more like a fresh start, even though we're, of course, obviously overbuilding this world. Also, on the flight home, I wanted to add, I listened to an Audible book called Civilized to Death, which I really recommend. It's a very eye-opening book that suggests that we have really left behind our basic human nature, that over 95% of human evolution took place in a manner in which we were living more like animals, nomadic, with hunter-gatherer situations, in small groups of 150 or less, who really would have each other's back, who were fiercely egalitarian, and who were very loving and sharing of childcare and things like that. And it explained a lot about what's happening to our mental health, really, and civilization, that we are not ourselves all that unlike many of the factory farmed animals that we feel sorry for, that we ourselves are living in a certain kind of zoo. And it may be comfortable, or less so in many cases, for people living in big skyscrapers. And in any case, there's no going back. So I pondered on this for a while, and I think that we need to look for new ways of living, such as co-housing or just reaching out to our neighbors more and getting together with people more and creating community. That's really what is natural for us as human beings. So with those reflections, I leave you and I wish you well. Namaste. Now, if you will excuse me, I think I will head back to the Middle Ages. It was so peaceful there.